What's going on, friends? If you ride Harley-Davidsons, just about everybody has got a story about a Sportster. Either they own one or they've at least ridden one at some point. Now, the Sportsters are really known for producing some high horsepower, but Sportsters really lack one thing compared to the Big Twin, aside from the obvious size of the bike, but that is torque from the engine. Now, when it comes to the Sportster engine, the number one thing that is usually sacrificed to get more horsepower out of these bikes is we sacrifice the low end and mid range. Sportsters, actually with the W cam in them, this is one of the best cams possible out there for low end and mid range. And a lot of times, the first thing we do with the Sportster after we get exhaust, a tune, and an air cleaner, we'll go ahead and put a set of cams in it. The bike runs a lot better up on top, up above 4,000 RPMs, but we've sacrificed a lot of that low end and mid range, which that's not necessarily good for the street. Now, you can make the bike come on earlier by doing a little re-gearing, but that can be really expensive unless you're running a chain and sprocket setup, which not everybody is. Before we get too far into the video today, please don't forget to hit that like button if you enjoyed the video, and please consider subscribing to the channel if you haven't done so already. So what usually ends up happening on the Sportster is we start chasing a peak horsepower number, trying to get as much power possible out of the bike, and we end up sacrificing all the low end, which isn't exactly good for the street because, you know, what good is 100 plus horsepower if you're having to run that thing up to about 6,500, 7,000 RPM? And if any of you have taken a Sportster up to 6,000 or above, that thing feels like it's trying to vibrate out of your hands. And that even includes the rubber mounted bikes as well. So instead of jumping right into cams, we should be looking at going with a big bore kit on the Sportster, either the 1250 or the 1275. Now, there's only one 1275 kit out there, and that's from Hammer. In my personal opinion, that's the one to go with. That thing, they put together a very nice package with that, and you get some significant power gains over the 1250. Now, obviously, if you have an 883, these things are putting out about 35, 40 horsepower and 40, 45 foot-pounds of torque. That's not much. Now, obviously, on an 883, that makes absolute sense to go ahead and convert it over to a 1250, 1275. I wouldn't even bother with a set of cams in an 883. Now, essentially, with the 883, you're going to be more than doubling your horsepower and torque output, even with the stock cams and the stock 883 heads. Yes, the 883 heads are different than the 1200 heads. So even a stock 1200, these things are roughly about 60 horsepower, 70 foot-pounds of torque. Just depends on which dyno graph you're looking at. Now, with an air cleaner, a jet kit, or a fuel tuner, and a good set of exhaust, even just a set of slip-ons, or a good 2-into-1, you're still only going to be getting about 70 foot-pounds of torque, and you might see horsepower close to 80. Now, while the horsepower is somewhat decent, 70 foot-pounds of torque, that's not a whole lot. Now, even on the 1200, this is where going to a 1250, 1275 makes a lot of sense and leaving your stock cams in place. Now, even going with a 1250, you're looking at torque upwards of about 80 foot-pounds, and with the new 1275 kit out there, you're looking at torque at roughly 87 foot-pounds. And not to mention the horsepower, that is a pretty good byproduct of chasing that torque increase. But the key here is that we're leaving the stock cams in. The stock cams are very well optimized for low-end and mid-range power on the Sportster. There's really nothing out there that's going to beat the W cams when it comes to low and mid-range power and torque. I've looked at a lot of different cams out on the market today, and the only cam that I've really seen that could top the stock factory Sportster cam in the low and the mid-range is Hammer's 570 cam. That 570 cam, this thing actually exceeds the W cam in the low and the mid range. Now, yeah, you could go ahead and put one of those in a 1200, but you're not going to really see that high torque gain that you would normally get with just the big bore kit alone. A 1275 or 1250 big bore kit with the stock cams, you're going to gain quite a bit of low and mid range power, but you are going to sacrifice the top end when you have the factory cam in there with the big bore kit. That's really the trade-off there. So do you need to add the cam and the big bore kit together? Well, not necessarily if you're just interested in the low and mid range. If you're just interested in the low and the mid range, going up to a 1275 kit is the way to go. The 1275 kit alone, while it bumps the low and mid range, it's not going to have a lot of peak horsepower output because it starts to become limited by the W cams, which are optimized for the low end and mid range. So if you decide to pair, say, their 570 cam with the 1275 kit, you're going to get roughly about the same amount of torque all throughout the RPM range, but where the cam's going to help you is up on top. That's going to help push your horsepower up even higher over what the big bore kit with the stock cams would do. So to really garner any low and mid-range power on a Sportster, there's really not much more you need to do other than a big bore kit. Now, if you're interested in getting more top end paired with that low and mid-range, then it's time to go ahead and change the cam out. And another little trick when it comes to the Sportsters is the exhaust system. The Sportsters do very, very well with their factory header. You really can't take away anything from the factory header on a Sportster. They're going to perform very well with just a set of slip-ons. But now remember, with just a set of slip-ons, if you pull the baffles out, you're going to sacrifice low and mid-range horsepower. But you're going to gain it up on top, but it's going to be way up on top, wide open throttle. So surprisingly, the Screamin Eagle exhaust, while they may not be the loudest exhaust out there, they do sound very good for what they are. The Screamin Eagle exhaust really excel at torque production. If you're looking at low to mid range up to about 4,500, it's really hard to beat a set of Screamin Eagle slip-ons for that. These things produce massive torque, massive torque, but the trade-off is it absolutely destroys your top-end horsepower. So to aid in low and mid-range torque production, if you're using slip-ons or even a 2-in-1 exhaust, is to go ahead and change the baffles out. Leave the standard baffle in. The standard baffle is really a good mixture of the best of both worlds. You get good low-end and mid-range, and you get a decent top-end power output, even with the W cams. But if you want even more low and mid-range paired with a big bore kit, is put in basically their quiet baffles. It will knock the sound down a little bit, but it will help out your low and mid-range tremendously. But once again, there's that trade-off. That is going to cost you up on top. So guys, there really isn't any huge secret to producing power on a Sportster. You really just need a good bolt-on big bore kit, whether it's a 1250 or a 1275. You can get them from Revolution, you can get them from Hammer, you can get it from S&S. But just keep in mind, the 1275, Hammer's got the lock on that. They're the only place you can get them. And in my opinion, their 570 cam is probably the absolute best street cam out there for the low and mid range. Now, don't get me wrong, it does add a little bit of decent horsepower on top as well. But guys, this really isn't all that complicated. The only thing you're doing is bolting on a set of big bore cylinders and pistons onto a Sportster, and it's really not that expensive to do. You could do this yourself for less than $1,000, and you get some serious gains out of it. I mean, if you love your Sportster and you're thinking about a big twin, but you don't want to spend that money, this is a great route to go. Now, granted, a Sportster is never going to have the big twin torque. You could go all out and get crazy with your Sportster and bore the cases and go to an 88-inch kit, but that's really getting way off in the weeds, and the cost goes way up from there versus just the bolt-on kits. But also another thing you got to remember too, guys, is that the fuel-injected Sportsters, they're going to tend to have a little bit more power than the carbureted Sportsters. Well, any rubber-mounted Sportster for that fact, because the rubber-mounted Sportsters 04, 05, 06, they had much better heads on them than they had in 91 to 03. And not only that, with the FI Sportsters, you have the ability to tune each cylinder individually. As you know, all Harleys are one single carburetor, which doesn't allow you to individually tune both cylinders. But with the fuel injection, you've got one injector per cylinder, and that allows you to tune them individually, which is going to get you more power output. So guys, I appreciate you watching. That was the #1 question that had been coming up for a while is, yeah, Sportsters, what can I do to my Sportster to get more horsepower out of it? And obviously, converting an 883 to a 1200, but if you already have a 1200, everybody always talks about those peak horsepower numbers, and really, is it worth going to a big bore kit on a 1200? Absolutely. That's some of the best money you can spend on your 1200, and absolutely the best money you can spend on an 883, period. But anyhow, guys, that's all I've got for you this week. If you enjoyed the video, please don't forget to hit that like button, and please remember to subscribe to the channel if you haven't done so already. But until next week, guys, you stay safe on the streets, ride smart, dodge the cars, and I'll catch you back here in next week's video. Thanks for watching.